Hi guys, it's Mr. Y. Today we're going to be wrapping up our genetics unit by talking about pedigree diagrams. So today you're going to learn how to read pedigree diagrams properly, how to draw your own pedigree diagrams, and how to use pedigree diagrams to make conclusions about past and future genotypes within a single family. Also within this you're going to learn how to recognize sex-linked recessive traits in pedigree diagrams. I didn't put that in there, but it should say recessive traits, and how to draw sex-linked traits in pedigree diagrams. Alright, first rule on pedigree diagrams. There's two shapes. There's circles and there's squares. Boys are the squares, girls are always the circles. That doesn't ever change. So, this is a standard example of a pedigree diagram. You can see it kind of looks like a family tree a little bit. You would have father here, mother here, and then 1, 2, 3 kids. Now, the first generation is typically called the F1 generation. Sometimes it's called the parental generation. And then the next generation is called the F2 generation. Before I go on to that, the line between these two here indicates reproductive mating, i.e. their spouses. And then the line coming down from that also indicates that they've produced offspring through that reproductive mating. Time proceeds downward, so you always start going down in time. In other words, if you go high up, you're going backwards in time. If you go down towards the bottom of the page, you're going more towards the current time. So again, circles are girls, squares are boys. And for this next example, I'm going to take a very simplified version of real life. We're going to suppose for a minute that there's only 2 types of hair color. Now I know there's lots more than 2 types of hair color. But for this example, we're going to suppose there's only 2 types. That there's brown hair, which we're going to call dominant, capital B, and there's blonde hair, which we're going to call recessive, lowercase b. And again, I know there's more than 2 types of hair color, but just bear with me so we can work through the example here. So if we're interested in studying the trait of brown hair as it passes through a family, the ones we're going to be interested in with are the ones that were homozygous dominant or heterozygous, and we would shade those in like this. Those that we're not interested in this case the blonde hairs, the ones who are homozygous recessive, we will leave unshaded like this. And keep in mind, the trait we're looking at, the trait that we shade in, can be either dominant or recessive. It's really up to us. So we can be shading in a dominant trait, or we could be shading in a recessive trait. We just have to make sure we know what we're looking for. So here's an example. Go ahead and see if you can figure out how many individuals are actually in this pedigree diagram. And I'll give you a second. You can pause the video. Then figure out how many have brown hair, how many have blonde hair, how many boys have brown hair, how many boys have blonde hair, how many girls have brown hair, how many girls have brown hair. So you should see that there is at least 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 girls who have brown hair, and 1 girl who has blonde hair. One right here, sorry, made a bad one. And then there's 1, 2, 3, 4 boys that have brown hair, and 1 boy who has blonde hair. Now in this generational system we would say this one here and this one here are the grandparents in this case. They had how many kids directly? Well, they produced 3 kids, here, here, and here. And 2 of those kids had spouses of their own, here and here, and then had kids further on their own. 1 kid here, and then 2 girls here, and 1 boy here. Hope that made sense. If not, go back and rewatch this one particular slide to make sure you get it right, because it will get more complex as we go. Now, again, the brown hair would show up in the grandmother in this case. The blonde hair showed up in the grandfather. And you'll note that one of their kids, the daughter, the circle here, ended up having blonde hair too, whereas both boys tended to have brown hair, and then the spouses both had brown hair. Thus, all the grandkids came out with brown hair as well. Because again, brown hair, we're assuming in this example, is the dominant trait. So here's where we can start to see the real power of pedigrees become apparent, because you can actually use the phenotype, the physical makeup of a family, just from observations of their traits to determine their genotype. So this is the same pedigree diagram from before. And what we can tell from this, again, brown hair is dominant, blonde hair is recessive, is we know the exact genotypes of at least this person and this person. We know this because they both have blonde hair. And the only way you have blonde hair is if they both have little b, little b. They're both homozygous recessive for blonde hair. Plus, if you think about it, because this daughter here is homozygous recessive, well, she got one little b from her father, who is blonde as well. And where did the other one come from? Well, it had to come from her mother. Meaning, the mother is actually heterozygous. It's the only way this situation works out. And now that you know these two parents, you can figure out the genotype of the two boys. The two boys they had, well, here and here, they both have to be heterozygous. The reason we know they're both heterozygous is because one little b had to come from the father. That's all he could give. It's either this little b or this little b. Had to go to their sons. And then the capital B came from the mother. The brown hair was dominant because they both showed brown hair. They had the capital B come from the mother. Otherwise, they would have been blonde. Now, if we assume that the boy here and the girl here both married spouses that were homozygous dominants, both capital B's, then we can at least figure out one of the grandchildren as well. Because if this is lowercase b, and this is homozygous dominant, capital B, we know the granddaughter here has to be heterozygous as well. These grandkids, it's a tougher thing to figure out because it could be capital B, lowercase b, or it could be capital B, capital B. Either way is a possibility for brown hair, and you wouldn't know exactly until they had kids of their own, not without doing a genetic test at least. So this is where you can actually start to see the power of pedigree diagrams. Just by looking at a trait and knowing what's dominant and what's recessive and who has what trait, you can actually start to figure out the genotypes of individuals that you've never even met. Now, let's try a more familiar family with you. This is going to be based upon the Simpsons family tree, which is going to be a little bit more elaborate than what I'm showing you on the screen here, but it's actually accurate to within a certain degree of the TV show. So in this situation, we have, again, 3 generations. We are going to assume in the Simpsons world that yellow and brown hair are dominant, capital Y for yellow, and we're not really interested in that. What we're actually interested in is the recessive trait in this case, that is to say the blue hairs. Now keep in mind, blue hairs doesn't really exist, but it does in the Simpsons world. So in this situation, you can see I've actually set up a representation of the Simpsons family tree. You have the 3 kids down here, Bart, Lisa, and Maggie. You have Homer Simpson here, Marge Simpson here, Marge's 2 sisters, and then each of their parents at the top. Now, who can you figure out for certainty very easily? The recessives. All the blue-haired people, in this case all the blue hairs are girls, are going to be homozygous recessive. That is to say they're all going to be little y in every case. But because you know Marge is homozygous recessive, you can also figure out her kids, because what's the only gene, the only allele she could give to any of her kids? Well, it's the lowercase y, which means each of her kids are homozygous. And we know they're heterozygous. We know they're heterozygous because none of them have blue hair and their mom does. And that's the only thing she could donate to them. So where did the capital Y come from? Well, that, of course, had to come from Homer Simpson. So he's at least one capital Y, but we'll figure out what he is in a bit. Let's finish through some of the other recessives. Again, her sisters both have blue hair, so they're both homozygous recessive. Marge's mother has blue hair. Now, this actually tells you what Marge's father actually is, because if you look, to have 3 daughters that are both homozygous recessive, they got one little Y from their mother, doesn't matter which one, and another one had to come from the father, meaning Marge's father and her sister's father had to be heterozygous. It's the only situation that works. Notice he had to be heterozygous in the fact that he himself didn't have blue hair, but his kids did. Now let's switch to the other side, Homer Simpson. Well, we know Homer has a capital Y at least. Can you figure out what else he has? Does he have another capital Y or does he have a lowercase y? Is he heterozygous or is he homozygous dominant? Well, to find out, you have to look at his parents. If you look at his mother here, she has blue hair as well, which means she's homozygous recessive. And because she's homozygous recessive, you know Homer has to be heterozygous because one lower Y came from the mother and the other capital came from his father, who didn't have blue hair. Grandpa Simpson doesn't have blue hair. And you'll note that Grandpa Simpson is the only one on this whole family tree you can't quite figure out, because he could be homozygous dominant or he could be heterozygous. Either way would work because he only had the one son there and he obviously didn't have blue hair. So it's unclear exactly what the genotype of Abraham Simpson, Grandpa Simpson, is. Again, all based upon looking at the traits and knowing what's dominant and what's recessive. Now, how does this relate to other aspects? Because not everything works in this nice, neat, dominant, recessive pattern. You'll note that when it comes down to actually distinguishing genetics, and I've shown you something similar to this before, even sex can be determined a bit by genetics. So with males versus females, you recall from one of my previous PowerPoints, it's X's and X's, X and X is a female, XY is a male. And you'll notice something here. Females can only give an X chromosome. That's all they have because they're females, they're XX. Males can give either the X or the Y chromosome. And if you notice here in the Punnett square, you'll see there's a percentage here. 2 out of 4 times you produce a female. And the other 2 out of 4 times you produce a male. And again, the chances theoretically are equal, though it's not quite equal in real life. And note still that the father's sperm determines the gender of the child because only the male can give the Y chromosome or the X chromosome. So if he gives the X, it's going to be a girl. If he gives the Y, it's going to be a boy. And again, you've seen this picture before showing you the sex chromosomes. You recall that the non-sex chromosomes are called autosomes. So these here on the top left are the autosomes, whereas here is the sex chromosomes, the 23rd pair. This would be a male in this case because it's XY. If it was a female, you'd see 2 long X's. And again, remember the Y chromosome has less DNA than the X chromosome. You can see that in the little image here. There's much more DNA coiled up here, 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 and here on the regular X chromosome than there is the Y chromosome. Now, this gets back to the idea of pedigrees when we talk about what's called sex-linked genes. These are genes, segments of DNA that code for proteins that are inherited on either the X or the Y chromosomes of the sex pair of chromosomes. So not on the autosomes, but on the sex chromosomes. And really the ones we're interested in tend to be the ones that don't exist on the Y chromosome, but do exist on the X chromosome. So let me give you a standard genetics example. Eye color in fruit flies. You can see here in the picture there's actually 2 sets of eye color. There's either red eyes, which is dominant, capital R, or there's white eyes, which is recessive, lowercase r. And this is how it becomes sex-linked, because in the X chromosome for fruit flies, you can have either the dominant allele or the recessive allele. But when it comes to the Y chromosome, the DNA is missing. It's not there. There's no allele either way. It's not dominant, it's not recessive, it's just non-existent. The DNA doesn't exist. So because of that, because there's no eye color gene on the Y chromosome, the X chromosome up here becomes the determining factor on what color of eyes the fruit fly will have. And if you break this down, what you'll note is you have a different set of possibilities for each sex. So for instance, for the females, these are all the females here on the top before the dotted line. You could be homozygous dominant, heterozygous, or homozygous recessive. For the males, you could be either dominant or recessive. There's no heterozygous in this case. The phenotype for each of these, well, this first one would be a female with red eyes, another female with red eyes. This would be a female with white eyes. And then below that, male with red eyes, male with white eyes. And again, The top 3 are all female because they're XX. The bottom 2 are both males because they're XY. But notice again the odds. The odds of getting the recessive trait change depending upon the gender of the fly. So the odds of getting white eyes, if you're a female, statistically speaking, are only a third, 33%. Whereas if you're a male, the odds or the chances of you having white eyes is now 50%. All that just based upon the gender, based upon the XY system. Now let's try an example that's somewhat closer to home. We're going to talk a little bit about red-green color blindness. This is also a recessive sex-linked trait in humans where, again, there's the dominant gene for eye color, eye color vision, the recessive trait for red-green color blindness, but the Y chromosome has no DNA for color vision at all. It doesn't exist. So it changes the odds of getting red-green color blindness depending upon your gender. So again, for the girls, you could be homozygous dominant, this case, both capital E's. This person would have normal vision. You could be homozygous recessive, both lowercase. This case, this girl, this female, would be red-green colorblind, and because we're interested in red-green colorblind, I went ahead and shaded this circle in. For the males, you could either be the dominant version, normal color vision, or the colorblind version, the recessive version. So notice the chances of being colorblind if you're a male is 1/2 compared to the female, which is only 1 out of 3. But here's where it gets interesting. The female has a chance to be what's called a carrier. A carrier is someone who carries the gene but does not express the gene themselves. This female here has perfect color vision. They have perfect color vision because they have the dominant trait, but they are carrying the recessive gene that can be passed on, and perhaps some of her offspring could eventually be colorblind. That's what separates them from the regular color vision. They see perfectly fine. They don't know they are a carrier, and they wouldn't know unless they got a genetic test or until they had offspring. So in recessive sex-linked traits, 2 traits show up, especially in the pedigree diagrams. The girls can be carriers, the heterozygous ones, heterozygous forms, whereas no boys can be carriers. It's impossible for a male to be a carrier for red-green color blindness. But the boys are more often, because it's 1/2 versus 1/3, more often fully affected than the girls, just by pure statistics. With the boys, you have a 50-50 chance. With the girls, statistically speaking, you have a 1 out of 3 chance. Those are 2 traits that always show up for recessive sex-linked traits in pedigree diagrams. Now, to test for color vision, you could take a lot of different tests that would test you for red-green color blindness, and there's different types of red-green color blindness. I'm not going to go into it, but the basic tests work like this. There's a link here in the screen, and I'm also going to put a posting of this link in the description if I don't remind me, and I'll put it in there. But they give you a bunch of splotches and they say, can you see the number? Now this one anybody should be able to see, even if you're red-green colorblind. You should see the number 12 in this splotch. But some of these other ones I'm about to show you may be a bit tougher. Now, this number I have a hard time with, and I'll be the first to tell you, I'm actually red-green colorblind. So I can see parts of a number, but I don't actually know the number itself. I had to ask my wife what the number was, and she told me, if you look hard enough, you see the number 74. If you could see the 74 without me telling you what the answer was, then you have probably okay color vision. Not guaranteed, though. If you couldn't, let's hang on and go through a few more of these tests. This one I can almost see now. This one, if you look and you can't see the number, again, you may want to actually talk to an eye doctor a little bit and ask them about red-green color blindness. The number here should be 60, and I can kind of see it. I kind of cannot. It's difficult for me, but I can make out parts of it. And again, there's different degrees, so everybody should be able to see number 1 is the number 25. But can you see the other numbers? So take a minute, look at the other numbers, see if you can pick them out. So number 25 is for the first one, 29 is for the second one, 45 for the third, 56 for the fourth, 8 for the sixth one, And number 5, well, even my wife couldn't help me on that one. She couldn't find a number anywhere. So if anybody can figure that one out, by all means, let me know what it is. So, red-green color blindness affects quite a few people, but it does affect boys more often than girls. And here's why. Again, girls can be carriers. And in this basic pedigree diagram, what do we see? We see a girl carrier. So we automatically know her genotype. We know she is heterozygous. She has one dominant allele on one X chromosome and then one recessive allele on the other X chromosome. Because the male, the father, has perfect color vision, he doesn't have any red-green color blindness. That's why he's not shaded in. We know he has the dominant allele. Now notice what happens. We can actually tell the genotypes of 2 out of 3 of the offspring. We know the first boy having perfect color vision has to have gotten the dominant allele from his mother, because the Y chromosome came from the father. Whereas the second boy, the middle child, got the recessive colorblind gene from his mother, and again the Y chromosome from the father. The girl, the daughter, is harder to figure out, because maybe she's a carrier, maybe she's not. She definitely got at least the X dominant E from the father, but the other X, well, it could be hard to tell. And either you do one of two things. You either do a genetic test, or you wait for her to have her own kids and see if any of them exhibit the trait of red-green color blindness. Now I'm going to change this in the next slide just to show you, because, believe it or not, what you're seeing is actually my own family. My mother is here. This is my father. Me and my brother are both red-green colorblind. My sister has perfect color vision. But is she a carrier? We don't know. We'd have to wait till she has kids of her own, which she actually has, to see if they have red-green color blindness. And again, we'd want to look for it more in the boys than we would the girls, because again, boys are more often fully affected than girls in this situation, whereas girls tend to be carriers. So this is actually a pretty accurate representation of my entire family tree now that all 3 of the kids here have now been married. Again, my mom is the carrier, dad, normal color vision, and then both sons, red-green colorblind, whereas my sister is fine. As I said, we've all been married and we all have kids now. So we can actually determine the likelihood of having a child with red-green color blindness, and we can actually figure out the genotypes of this. Again, we know the grandparents, heterozygous, and just dominant. It's not homozygous because it's not the same, because it's an X and a Y. The second generation, well, it gets kind of tricky. Again, you don't know what the daughter is. She could be a carrier, she couldn't be. The reason we're not sure on this is because, well, she had a girl. So maybe the girl's, my niece here, maybe she's a carrier as well. And then my brother's wife, again, we're not sure of, but we do know that his 2 girls here and here have normal color vision. So does his son. My son is going to be perfectly fine because he's going to get the Y chromosome from me and the X chromosome from his mother, who has no history of red-green color blindness in her family. And then my niece, well, again, like her mother, it's hard to tell. She got at least one X from her father, and the other X came from her mother. But again, it could be this X or it could be this X, so maybe she's a carrier, maybe she's not. No way to really tell without genetic testing. So you can figure out a good portion of individuals without doing any genetic tests whatsoever, but some you actually either have to wait till they have kids of their own, or you have to look further back in their family tree. My sister-in-law here, I don't know for sure because I don't know enough of her family history to determine whether she's potentially a carrier for red-green color blindness. So, just by looking at a pedigree diagram, you should be able to tell by this point whether a trait that's being shown is a recessive sex-linked trait. Again, the things you're looking for, girls are carriers, which means they look like this, only halfway shaded in. And you have a higher proportion, of boys fully affected than girls. So a lot more boys shaded in and fully affected by the trait than girls. So looking at this pedigree diagram, what would you say? Is this a recessive sex-linked trait, or is it an autosomal trait? Remember, autosomes are just the regular chromosomes. That's how you pass regular traits on. So just by looking, you should be able to tell if it's sex-linked or autosomal. Looking at this one, I see a carrier, and I see 2 boys affected versus, so 2 boys versus 0 girls, and 1 carrier. My guess is, without even knowing what this trait is, whatever it is it's looking at, this is a recessive sex-linked trait. Let's try this again. So let's look at the diagram again and see if you can determine whether it's sex-linked or it's autosomal. Autosomal is the opposite of sex-linked. So first question, do you see any female carriers? Are there any females working as carriers to pass the trait on to future offsprings? So there any? No, there's no carriers here. Now let's look at the ratio of boys that are fully affected versus girls that are fully affected. How many boys are fully affected? Well, if you look, you'll see 1, 2, 3 boys compared to 2 girls. Now, it's not even, but in a diagram this size, it's kind of hard to get it to be perfectly even anyway. The bigger the diagram, the more likely it is to be even. Remember, this is all based upon probability. So this is a pretty good equalized ratio. So without knowing what this trait is, I would assume that it's autosomal. That is to say, it's not sex-linked. So we say that's autosomal. Let's try this one more time. Here's another pedigree diagram. Can you tell me whether or not it's sex-linked? Again, if it's not sex-linked, the term is autosomal. So, are there any carriers? That's your first question. In this case, yes. How many? You have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 carriers. Notice, again, only females can be carriers. You will never see a male carrier because males can't be carriers because they are male. They are XY. And let's look at the ratio of boys affected versus girls affected. Again, fully affected, not the carriers. The carriers don't count. They're not fully affected. How many boys are fully affected? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. You have 6. How many girls are fully affected? Just this one. Notice the ratio is much more clear in this case. You have 6 boys to just 1 girl fully affected. This is probably the telltale sign of it being a sex-linked trait, whatever the trait is. So, a sex-linked, most likely recessive trait. So that's going to wrap up the genetics units, guys. Make sure you look back through this, especially with reading through pedigree diagrams and determining the genotypes of the different things. So make sure you practice on that and ask questions in class if you have any.